40% of Gen Alpha do not have basic reading skills. That's the highest level in over 2 decades. And nearly half of all new teachers are already leaving the field. Fourth grade reading scores are falling back toward levels we saw in the 1980s. You'd think the greatest technological era in human history would mean kids are reading better. But they're not. 61% are below proficient in math. There are more fourth graders who know the viral trends than can explain the difference between even and odd numbers. And this didn't happen by accident. This is a system shaped by decades of decisions. Decisions that prioritize short-term outcomes over the long-term development of an entire generation. And the thing is, if you zoom out far enough, you can actually trace exactly when and how it all started to fall apart. The dominoes started falling in the early 1970s. That's when the country began formally tracking educational progress. And for the first time, something genuinely promising was happening. Students were staying in school longer. Reading and math scores were stable or climbing. Graduation rates were climbing. Millions of students who had been previously excluded were finally receiving a formal education. And the money was flowing. States were investing in expanding schools, hiring staff, building a more inclusive system. It felt like progress. Real, measurable progress. But that progress had an expiration date. In the early 1980s, Ronald Reagan entered office with a specific platform: eliminate the Department of Education. He believed education shouldn't be federal. So a secretary named Terrell Bell did something clever. He assembled a commission not to evaluate the system, but to justify why the department needed to exist. The result was a 1983 report called A Nation at Risk, and it was designed to create a crisis narrative. Insiders later admitted they began with a predetermined conclusion: widespread mediocrity. Then they cooked the books. They highlighted declining averages and international comparisons while ignoring one obvious reality: more students were entering the system and taking those same tests. When the data was actually broken down across all categories, the nation's education system was improving. But none of that mattered. The report used language like a rising tide of mediocrity and compared education to an act of war by a foreign power. It dominated public discourse, it drowned out the actual gains of the 1970s, and it justified a massive shift away from teaching students how to learn towards standardization, testing, and measurable outcomes. That shift set the foundation for everything that followed. As a result of this manufactured crisis, influential figures began promoting what they called solutions. Most notably, the education system shifted away from phonics, where students learned to read by sounding out words, toward an approach called cueing. Students were encouraged to guess unfamiliar words based on sentence structure, surrounding context, or pictures. Instead of actually decoding them, students appeared fluent, but they never developed the ability to break down the words on the page. Lucy Calkins became one of the most influential figures pushing this movement. Her curriculum reached roughly 16% of all kindergarten through second grade teachers nationally, and even after the 2000 National Reading Panel strongly endorsed systematic phonics, her approaches remained in place. She continued promoting cueing strategies long after they were shown to harm beginning and struggling readers. It contributed directly to a widespread literacy crisis. At the same time, policies like No Child Left Behind further reshaped the system. Instead of improving how students were taught, it tied school funding and performance directly to standardized test results. Teachers and administrators were forced to prioritize whatever could be measured. The curriculum narrowed. Teachers taught to the test. Foundational skills like decoding and comprehension were pulled to the background. Long-term development didn't matter. But there was a darker side. Because performance was measured through aggregate test scores, schools were punished for low proficiency rates across entire student populations. Struggling students became a liability. Retaining them meant those same low scores would be counted again the following year, and it increased long-term dropout risk. So instead of addressing foundational gaps, many schools pushed students forward. They reclassified performance. They used test-focused interventions. They protected overall metrics. For decades, Gen Alpha moved through a system no longer built around learning. It increasingly resembled a glorified daycare. And as these policies took hold, the burden of failure shifted onto teachers. They became replaceable cogs rather than skilled professionals. Teachers now face a pay penalty approaching 27%. They earn significantly less than similarly educated professionals. Real wages have declined over the past decade despite record spending. Over 70% hold a second job. 31% work in roles like Uber or retail just to make ends meet. They manage classrooms of 23 to 26 students. 77% report their job as frequently stressful, and 52% say they would not advise a young person today to become a teacher. That's the sign that something has fundamentally broken. I spoke with an elementary school interventionist with over 20 years of experience. She explained the extra burden teachers now face every single day, from start to finish. She told me, the social emotional support is heavier now than it's ever been because structures and supports at home are not as strong. And then there's the time requirement. You're always expected to have something planned, but there are so many meetings that must happen, there's no planning time. So that burden shifts to outside of work. How do you make that happen when you're working a second job, running after kids? These things are really hard on teachers. Now, you might wonder, if this decay has been building for decades, why are we only seeing it show up with Gen Alpha now? The answer is simple. 54% of American adults read below a 6th grade level. Nearly half cannot read a book written at an 8th grade level. In math, 34% of US adults scored at the lowest levels of numeracy. They can barely do simple addition and subtraction. The United States is near the bottom among developed countries. When you combine a system that has failed generation after generation, an environment where teachers are overworked and undervalued, and a generation that is the first to grow up without knowing a world without smartphones, tablets, and social media, what reason would Gen Alpha have to not be facing this crisis? Unlike previous generations who watched their parents read the newspaper or visited libraries, Gen Alpha grew up in a fundamentally different world. By age 2, nearly 40% already have their own tablet. By elementary school, 46% have their own smartphone. Among children aged 8 to 10, 65% spend at least 4 hours a day on social media interacting with adult content by age 11. And while it's easy to blame corporations or the system, the reality is that 2-year-olds are being handed tablets. 69% of parents say they are addicted to their phones, spending more time scrolling than with their own children. A generation raised in that environment struggles to focus or self-regulate inside the classroom, especially when they lose access to their device. Teachers told me, it's not uncommon to have classrooms where one child's dysregulation means the entire room has to be cleared. 1 to 3 adults are needed to help regulate that child. And so you start looking at the time demands and the lack of learning happening with the other 21 children. It happens every day. When you have a generation entering school with weaker foundational skills and shorter attention spans, remote learning during the pandemic created the largest learning loss in modern history. It skipped over critical years for developing reading, focus, and comprehension. And because the system kept pushing students forward despite lacking those foundational skills, it widened the gap. 65 to 70% of students who cannot meet basic reading requirements come from low-income households. Those students are 3 times more likely to be chronically absent from school. And as this gap widens, something darker emerges. Teachers told me students are stealing food because they don't have it at home. When you start thinking about it, not why is he stealing, but he doesn't have food, he's stealing because he's hungry, it changes everything. Children from poverty enter school 1 million words behind middle-class children. That vocabulary gap compounds every single year. And while each of these structural issues alone creates severe consequences, the nation is now rushing to integrate AI into classrooms, subjecting an already fragile generation to the first large-scale test of how AI reshapes learning. A recent study from MIT found something striking. When people used AI to complete writing tasks, their brains showed significantly lower engagement compared to working through material themselves. They demonstrated weaker neural connectivity, lower memory retention, and struggled to recall what they wrote. 44% of teenagers already use AI for at least some schoolwork. 10% rely on it for most or all of it. 60% of students say AI is already being used to cheat either somewhat often or very often. Just like the queuing approach that created the literacy crisis, AI is showing similar patterns in cognitive ability. It becomes a technologically advanced magnifying glass for all the problems the system already presents, and there are no guardrails in place. So when Gen Alpha enters the job market, this rapid pursuit of AI has the potential to reduce human cognitive agency, critical thinking, and independent problem solving. But fundamentally, this is an unbelievably complex issue. There isn't one thing you can point to and say this is the problem. This is decades of decay. Yes, 40% of 4th graders can't read, but half of American adults can't read above a 6th grade level. We're talking about serious systemic issues. The K-shaped economy is only getting worse. There's no incentive for it not to. We're talking about a serious education crisis. Teachers making less than they were a decade ago. Millions of first through fifth graders stealing food from school because they're hungry. Childhood poverty is increasing rapidly. There's a dramatic resurgence in child labor. The United States doesn't have a money issue, it has a values issue. We do not care about our future. We've been so busy trying to make this country great again since the 1980s that we forgot to figure out where we're actually going. And so we don't cherish the individuals instilling values into our youth. They're replaceable cogs. It's a tragedy. It's very obvious we don't care about emerging generations. It continuously happens and nothing is being done to stop it. By the time Gen Alpha reaches my age, the world will be unrecognizable. We're doing nothing to guide them. But here's the thing. I spend time around young kids, 4 and 3 years old, and they instill hope in me. I see the future and the ability to instill good values. But I also see they had tablets at 2 years old. At 3 and 4, they're already telling responsible adults to F off. I found the girl scrolling TikTok at 3 years old. There are nuances here. Parents are working. They're doing the best they can. But parents need to do more. And yes, our education system needs to do more. What this requires is complex conversation and community. These issues are too big for one person to solve alone. And what we need is collaboration. This is going to take a village to recoup and overcome the losses we're facing now. My mom worked all day and cleaned the school to make ends meet. My stepdad sat at the table with flashcards helping me learn. They cared about my future. So here's what I'm saying. If you're older, don't be the grandparent who's done their job. And if you're a parent doing your best, keep going. Give a little bit more. These kids deserve it.